Excellent. Thank you so much, Marta. Good morning, everyone. I'm taking over from where Marta left, mostly. In his own lifetime, Aldo Novarese was virtually synonymous with the name of Nebiolo. As head of the foundry Studio Artistico, which was the company's drawing office, from 1952 until his retirement in 1974, during the following decades, Novarese became the only source for the history of the type foundry. This was partly due to the lack of other sources. The type foundry was closed down in 1978, and its archives were dispersed. And partly to the international recognition that Novarese enjoyed in the 1980s, not to mention his own writings. The existing literature on Nebiolo is generally limited to cursory catalogues of typefaces that invariably reflect Novarese's views. Not only were his accounts seldom checked, he often portrayed himself as a hero who, against all odds, achieves the long-deserved consecration. The obvious reference here is to Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folktale. Such a narrative is obviously cluttered by idealized overtones to the point of obliterating the key figure of the antagonist, or rather, in this case, the helper, and I mean Alessandro Butti. Alessandro Butti is little known among type historians because much of his work is usually attributed to Novarese. In fact, Novarese's Vulgate has obscured the contributions of Butti himself, but also of Giulio da Milano and even Raffaello Bertieri, not to mention the numerous assistants and draftsmen who, like Novarese himself, worked alongside the masters within the Studio Artistico. Alessandro Butti was born to a family of landowners and military in the province of Alessandria. Information is scant on his schooling and background in typography. We know that he entered Nebiolo in 1911, aged 18. In 1916, he won an award for designing an album of alphabets, and in the following years, he designed several covers for the graphic arts magazine Graphicus. By the 1920s, he was working in the in-house printing office, where the company's specimens and catalogs were designed and printed. Evidence based on so far unpublished documents and recent interviews with former employees should lead us to question the authorship of some of the typefaces which are generally attributed to Novarese and which appear to be earlier designs. What's more, witnesses point to Novarese's compulsion of adding his own name, or in some cases, even replacing the signature in the drawing office logbooks or the original drawings. A striking example is the lower case for Augustea. Augustea was based on imperial Roman inscriptional capitals and was issued in 1949, but the project had started much earlier. Butti went to Rome in 1938, accompanied by the young Novarese, and they photographed the Trajan column inscription and hundreds of other inscriptions based on which different variants, all sort of variants, were tested for each letter before deciding on a final set of letter forms to be included in the typeface. According to a memoir by Ennio Lavagno, who was assistant to Butti from 1942 to 1952, around 1951, Butti had designed the lowercase set, drafted in gouache by Lavagno himself, and Lavagno writes that a beautiful alphabet it was, yet Butti persisted in not wanting to release it for fear of offending the majesty of the Roman lapidary. In 1964, only a few years after Butti's death, an updated version of Augustea was eventually released, complete with lowercase letters, as Nova Augustea, signed by Novarese. Although Novarese made quite radical improvements, as you can see on Butti's original drawings, yet he was disingenuous, to say the least, in not crediting Butti as the original designer. A further example is Recta. The typeface was released in 1958 and further expanded into a large family with several widths and weight variants. Universe and Neue Haus Grotesque had been released only the previous year, and indeed Recta has always been seen as Nebiolo's reaction to the Swiss trend. Yet, from Lavagno's memoir, we know that while its Italic companion and all the other styles are later editions by Novarese, the original Recta was in fact designed by Butti before 1952, which implies that Butti had actually anticipated the neo-grotesque trend. In all likelihood, the management of the company was not convinced by Butti's ideas or did not want to take risks. So, as Marta has just shown us, the Nebiolo foundry was established in the 1880s, and the company used to operate 3 large plants in Turin, which made cast iron, printing equipment, and foundry type. Although nowadays the name of Nebiolo is associated, is identified as the largest and the most important type foundry in the 20th century, actually Nebiolo's mainstay and most profitable business throughout the 20th century was the manufacture of printing equipment rather than foundry type. The company, in the beginning, sold no original typefaces, except for Incunabula, an early Renaissance revival, especially designed for them by Raffaello Bertieri and released in 1911. But starting in the mid-20s, Nebiolo began releasing original typefaces with the help and the guidance of Bertieri at first, and then of Giulio da Milano, who was a painter and graphic artist. Among the typefaces produced in this early period, the most successful was Semplicità, and Butti was certainly involved as a draftsman in all of these projects. Semplicità is a geometric sans serif, much in the same modernist vein that was increasingly popular across Europe, as epitomized by Futura, of course. Accusations that Semplicità is a copy of Futura do not stand real scrutiny, because the typeface was released in 1928, while the first specimen of the Futura typeface dates back to December 1927. So obviously they share a common background, but most likely they were designed independently of each other. Indeed, Semplicità shows some Art Deco elements that makes it look quite different from Futura. As you can see, the lower bar in the cap A, and also some original features, such as the junctions in A, in lowercase a, B, D, P, Q. And we have to say that Semplicità was quite successful. Actually, it stayed, you can find it until the 1950s in the advertising sector. Probably following its success, the company, Nebiolo, decided to establish an in-house drawing office to design and brand new typefaces. And this was called Studio Artistico, or Art Studio. And Giulio da Milano was appointed as its first director, and Butti was his assistant.
È per loro intima gioia l'opera compiuta, opera spesso legata ad un indimenticabile periodo delle loro esistenze.
This is Alessandro Butti. You will now see a very young Novarese sitting at the table.
Negli speciali attrezzatissimi studi,
here
coadiuvati da uno scuolo di abili disegnatori, esse realizzano i nuovi alfabeti, stabiliscono la traccia di base a quello che sarà poi l'originale per la riproduzione. Eccoli al lavoro, organizzati nelle più importanti fonderie di caratteri, dove l'ausilio delle moderne attrezzature facilita il lavoro talvolta ossessionante nel metodo e nell'esecuzione. Si prova, si riprova una curva, una grazia. Si deve vedere con l'occhio delle riduzioni fino ai minimi corpi.
Okay. So, Giulio da Milano actually left in 1936, and Butti was appointed as new director of the studio. The office would last for over 40 years, under da Milano first, then Butti, and lastly Novarese. The studio's output varied considerably in style, but overall focused on display rather than continuous text typefaces. This is usually explained by the nature of Nebiolo's customers, who mainly were made up of small and medium-sized printing shops. who catered to the emerging advertising sector. When da Milano resigned in 1936, so Butti replaced him as head of the studio, a position he would hold for the next 16 years. And under his direction, Nebiolo released a dozen new typefaces that actually shaped the history of Italian printing, like Neon, Veltro, Fluidum, De Quirinus, Stile, several of them. Butti was extremely meticulous and had a tendency to correct his work over and over again. Most of his typefaces took several years to complete, and it seems that a fair number of designs were actually left as drawings and never made it into real typefaces, either because of Butti's tendency to procrastinate, or because they were thought of as too extreme by the management. In the early 1950s, Nebiolo had run into major financial difficulties, and many employees were made redundant. These were among the reasons that drove the Nebiolo management to dismiss Butti towards the end of 1952, in October 1952, when he was only 58. A few draftsmen within the art studio had resigned during the previous months, but Novarese was still working in the studio, so he was appointed as new director. In the following years, Novarese, an extremely talented designer and extremely prolific, quite the opposite of Butti, was able to return the studio to its former glory, and a second successful season started for the Nebiolo Type Foundry in the 1960s. Butti died in 1959, and Novarese wrote an obituary, which is one of the few extant surviving documents for Butti's biography. Novarese listed all of the typefaces that Butti had designed, and pointing out to his working alongside with him. However, a few years later, Novarese published a book on type design, Alpha Beta, which appeared in 1964, so only 5 years later, in which he showed some of the faces designed by Butti, but this time omitted Butti's name altogether and took all the credit for himself. Another notable case is Microgramma, which Novarese used in his books actually, to show the construction of the squarish sans serif. We know that Butti designed a typeface and drew the letter forms, but his name is not even mentioned. Microgramma, as you know, is a square-shaped, caps-only typeface released in 1952. Its distinguished look was actually accomplished by squaring the curves, as we can see. Like with Augustea and Recta, 15 years later, Novarese designed a lowercase set to go with it, added some condensed styles, and Nebiolo released the new type family under the new name Eurostile, Eurostyle. Prudence is a must, of course. We shouldn't jump to easy conclusion, yet these examples, based on information gathered from reliable sources, are sound evidence that offer some ground to modify our historical records. As I said, in the years following the closure of the Type Foundry, Novarese became the only source for its history. He wrote a lot, but his accounts have never been checked, and Butti was put on the back burner. Probably we will never know the true story, the whole story behind the type designs produced by the foundry. But I think it's time we put aside any awe of Novarese and consider his work in the light of detailed study of the entire history of the type foundry and of its art studio. Since Nebiolo's demise in 1978 and the ensuing dispersion of its archives, a critical assessment of its heritage is still missing. A new project led by Antonio Capedoni, who's following myself, James Clough, myself, Massimo Gonzato, and Riccardo Locco, aims to research archival evidence and oral history sources, and from first-hand experience, in order to document Italy's most renowned type foundry. So more to come in the next 2, 3, 4 years. Thank you.